Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. Frank Merrick's hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove through the winding mountain roads back to Boone. The lumber mill had taken longer than expected, but he'd found the perfect maple boards for the antique dresser restoration waiting in his workshop. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of oaks and pines, casting moving patterns across the asphalt. He slowed as he approached the small city park where a maintenance trail met the main road. Something caught his ear through the open window, a sound that made his blood freeze. Crying. Not just any crying. The desperate wail of an infant. Frank pulled over and killed the engine. The sound came again, weaker now, from the direction of the park's maintenance area. He walked toward the trail side, following the source until he stood before a large green trash bin. The crying came from inside. Frank's mind went blank for a moment, refusing to process what his ears told him. He lifted the heavy lid with shaking hands. There, wrapped poorly in a thin blanket that had come undone, lay his 3-month-old daughter. Nevaeh's face was red from crying, her tiny fists clenched. Her skin felt cold when he touched her cheek. Jesus Christ. The words came out as a whisper. Frank pulled her from the bin, rewrapping the blanket around her small body. She quieted slightly at his touch, but her breathing seemed shallow. He stripped off his flannel shirt and wrapped her in it, the thick material providing more warmth than the thin blanket. His hands fumbled for his phone. 911. What's your emergency? I need an ambulance. I found an infant in a trash bin at Deer Creek Park on Highway 421. She's alive but cold. She needs medical attention now. Sir, did you say you found an infant in a trash bin? Yes. She's my daughter. Someone put my daughter in a trash bin. The words sounded insane even as he spoke them. An ambulance is on the way. Stay on the line. Keep the child warm and check her breathing. Frank sat on the ground, holding Nevaeh against his chest. Her crying had turned to weak whimpers. He could feel her tiny heart beating fast against his ribs. Who would do this to you? He whispered to her. Who would throw you away like garbage? But even as he asked the question, a cold certainty began forming in his gut. Only one person had access to Nevaeh when he wasn't home. Only one person could have brought her here. The ambulance arrived within minutes, followed by a police car. The EMTs took over, checking Nevaeh's vitals and preparing her for transport. Sir, we need to take her to Watauga Medical Center, the lead EMT said. Her body temperature is low, but she appears stable. You can follow us. Frank nodded, unable to speak. He watched them load his daughter into the ambulance, her small form almost lost on the adult-sized stretcher. Officer Davis approached him. Mr. Merrick, I need to ask you some questions. How did you know to look in that trash bin? I heard her crying. I was driving by and heard her crying. And you're certain this is your daughter? Frank stared at him. I know my own child. Where is your wife right now? At home. At least, she should be at home with. Frank stopped. She should be at home with the baby. The hospital's fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and unreal. Frank sat in the waiting area while doctors examined Nevaeh. His mind kept replaying the moment he'd opened that trash bin, kept hearing her weak cries that a nurse approached. Mr. Merrick? Your daughter is going to be fine. She's dehydrated and her body temperature was low, but there's no permanent damage. We want to keep her overnight for observation. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by rage. Someone had put his daughter in a trash bin. Someone had left her there to die. Frank pulled out his phone and dialed home. Jean answered on the third ring. Hey, baby, how was the lumber yard? Her voice sounded normal, casual, like nothing had happened. Jean, where's Nevaeh? She's in her crib. I just checked on her 20 minutes ago. What? Frank felt the world tilt. You just checked on her? Yes, Frank. She's sleeping peacefully. You worry too much. I'm looking at her right now, Jean. She's in the hospital. A pause. What are you talking about? I found her in a trash bin. Someone put our daughter in a trash bin and left her there. That's impossible. She's right here in her. Check the crib, Jean. Check it right now. The line went quiet except for the sound of Jean's footsteps. Frank heard a door open, then silence. Jean, I don't understand. She was here. I just checked on her. No, you didn't. You know exactly where she was because you put her there. Frank, that's insane. Why would I? He hung up. Frank arrived home 2 hours later. The doctors had agreed to let him take Nevaeh home since her condition had stabilized, but they'd scheduled a follow-up appointment for the next day. He carried the sleeping baby through the front door of their small house. Jean stood in the living room, a paintbrush in her hand. Her easel held a half-finished landscape. She looked relaxed, almost cheerful. "Thank God you found her," Jean said, walking over to kiss his cheek. "Someone must have broken in and taken her. We should call the police." Frank stared at her. "Someone broke in, took the baby, drove 10 miles to a park, and put her in a trash bin? It's the only explanation that makes sense. Is it?" Jean set down her paintbrush and crossed her arms. "What are you implying, Frank?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. I called you. You said you just checked on her. She wasn't here. I made a mistake. I thought I checked on her, but I must have been thinking about earlier." Frank walked to Nevaeh's room and looked at the empty crib. The blankets were arranged as if someone had tried to make it look like a baby had been sleeping there. "Jean, come here." She appeared in the doorway. "What? Look at this crib. Look at how the blankets are arranged. It looks normal to me. It looks like someone tried to make it appear that a baby was sleeping here. The blankets are pulled up and shaped like there's a body underneath them." Jean shrugged. "I don't see what you're getting at." Frank turned to face her. His voice stayed level, controlled. "Tell me what really happened." "I already told you." "Someone must have. Tell me the truth." Jean stared at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. The concerned mother act fell away, replaced by something colder. "Fine. You want the truth? It was a test." "A test?" "Yes. I wanted to see how you'd react. I want to prove a point about how hard this is for me. Everyone expects me to be this perfect mother, but no one understands the pressure." Frank felt ice form in his chest. "You put our 3-month-old daughter in a trash bin as a test. I put her somewhere safe to make a point. You need to understand how overwhelming this is for me. The constant crying, the sleepless nights, the way everyone judges every little thing I do. She could have died. Don't be dramatic. I knew you'd find her. How could you possibly know that? Because you're obsessive about your routines. You always take that route home from the lumber yard." Frank looked at his wife, really looked at her. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd thought he loved, stood there defending putting their baby in a trash bin. Her face showed no remorse, no understanding of what she'd done. "You just forfeited every right you ever had," he said quietly. Jean laughed. "Oh, please. You overreact to everything. She's fine, isn't she?" Frank walked past her toward the door. "Where are you going?" Jean called after him. "Out. When will you be back?" Frank paused at the door. "I don't know if I will be." Frank drove to Ira's towing company on the outskirts of town. His older brother's business occupied a sprawling lot filled with damaged vehicles and heavy equipment. Ira emerged from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag. "Frank, what are you doing here? You look like hell. I need to talk to you." Ira studied his brother's face. "Come on back to the office." They walked through the garage, past the hydraulic lifts and tool benches, to a small office cluttered with paperwork and coffee cups. Ira closed the door and gestured to a chair. "What happened?" Frank told him everything. About finding Nevaeh in the trash bin, about Jean's lies, about her confession that it was a test. Ira's expression grew darker with each detail. "She put my niece in a goddamn trash bin," Ira said when Frank finished. "She put a 3-month-old baby in the garbage." "Yeah, and she's calling it a test." "Yeah." Ira stood up and paced to the window. "Where is she right now?" "At home. I'm going to kill her, Frank. I'm going to drive over there and beat her to death with my bare hands." "No, you're not." Ira spun around. "The hell I'm not. She tried to murder your daughter." "Ira, sit down." "I won't sit down." "That woman. Sit down." Frank's voice carried a tone that made Ira stop pacing. "If you go over there and lay a hand on her, you'll go to jail and she'll get sympathy. Is that what you want?" Ira sat, but his hands remained clenched into fists. "So, what do you want to do? Just let her get away with it. I want to take everything from her. Not just the baby. Everything." "What do you mean?" Frank leaned forward. "I mean, I want her to lose custody of Nevaeh permanently." I want her to lose any claim to our house, our savings, our assets. I want her to end up with nothing. And how do you plan to do that? Carefully, legally. We make this clean. We document everything. We build a case so strong that no judge would ever give her custody of a houseplant, let alone a child. Iris studied his brother's face. You're talking about war. I'm talking about justice. Same thing in this case. Ira leaned back in his chair. What do you need me to do? Help me think this through. Help me not make any mistakes that could hurt the case. What kind of mistakes? Like you going over there and beating her to death. Ira managed a grim smile. Yeah, I can see how that might complicate things. Frank pulled out a small notebook and pen. First, I need to document everything that happened today. Every detail, every conversation, every timeline. You think she'll try to deny it? I think she'll try to claim temporary insanity or postpartum depression or whatever her lawyer tells her to claim. Could that work? Not if I have enough evidence. Not if I can prove this is who she really is, not some temporary condition. Ira watched his brother write. You're different, Frank. I've never seen you like this. Like what? Cold. Calculating. Like you've already written her off completely. Frank looked up from his notebook. She put my daughter in a trash bin and called it a test. There's no coming back from that. There's no forgiveness for that. I'm done with her. Good, Iris said, because that woman doesn't deserve forgiveness. Frank continued writing. I need to get her to admit it again. On recording this time. You think she will? I think she's arrogant enough to believe she can justify anything. I think she actually believes what she did was reasonable. That's scary. That's useful. Frank returned home after midnight. Jean was asleep or pretending to be. He checked on Nevaeh, who slept peacefully in her crib. Tomorrow he would start building his case that he spent the early morning hours researching family law attorneys in North Carolina. By 6 a.m., he had a list of 3 lawyers with strong reputations for custody cases. He made appointments with all of them for later in the week. Jean appeared in the kitchen as Frank fed Nevaeh her morning bottle. I've been thinking about yesterday, Jean said, pouring herself coffee. Maybe I should see someone. A therapist. The stress of new motherhood might be affecting me more than I realized. Frank didn't look up from Nevaeh. You think stress made you put our daughter in a trash bin? I think sleep deprivation and hormones can make people do things they wouldn't normally do. So you wouldn't normally abandon an infant in a public place. Jean set down her coffee cup harder than necessary. You're not being fair, Frank. I'm trying to take responsibility here. Are you? Because yesterday you called it a test to prove a point. Now you're calling it a stress reaction. Maybe it was both. Frank finally looked at her. What point were you trying to prove? That this is harder for me than you realize. That I need more help. So you thought leaving our daughter somewhere I might never find her would somehow get you more help. I knew you'd find her. How? How could you possibly know that? Jean sat down across from him. Because you're predictable, Frank. You take the same routes. You follow the same patterns. I knew if I left her somewhere along your usual path home, you'd hear her crying. Frank stared at his wife. She was admitting to calculated planning. This wasn't a moment of postpartum psychosis or sleep-deprived, poor judgment. She had planned it. You're saying you deliberately chose that location because you knew I'd find her there? Yes. And if I hadn't taken that route? If I'd stopped somewhere else first? If I'd had the radio up too loud to hear her? Jean shrugged. But you didn't. Frank felt his phone recording in his shirt pocket. He'd started the app before coming downstairs, hoping to catch exactly this kind of conversation. Jean, help me understand your thinking. You thought leaving our 3-month-old daughter in a trash bin was safer than leaving her at home. Safer than with a man who thinks babies cry just to bother him. Frank's blood went cold. You think I'm a danger to my own daughter? I think you don't understand how hard this is. I think you judge me for struggling when you've never spent a full day alone with her. So your solution was to put her in a place where she could have frozen to death, been attacked by animals, or never been found at all. Don't be dramatic. She was fine. She was hypothermic when I found her. The EMT said another hour, and she could have had serious health problems. Jean waved her hand dismissively. They always exaggerate to cover themselves legally. Frank stood up, still holding Nevaeh. I need to run some errands today. I'll take the baby with me. You don't need to do that. I can watch her. No, You can't. Jean's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means you've lost the right to be alone with our daughter. Frank, you're being ridiculous. Yesterday was an isolated incident. Was it? Or was it just the first time I caught you? What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You put our baby in a trash bin. You showed no remorse. You called a test. You think it was justified. Those are facts. Jean stood up, her face flushed. I made a mistake. I'm trying to make amends by claiming it was a stress reaction instead of a calculated test. You can't even keep your story straight. I don't have to listen to this. You're right. You don't. Frank headed toward the door with Nevaeh. I'll be back later. Frank, wait. He paused at the door. We need to work this out. For the baby's sake. Frank turned to look at his wife. No, Jean. We really don't. Frank's first stop was the Department of Social Services office in downtown Boone. He'd called ahead and been assigned to meet with Mara Jenks, a CPS investigator with 15 years of experience. That Mara's office was small and cluttered with case files. She looked tired but alert, the kind of person who'd seen everything and wasn't easily shocked. Mr. Merrick, you said on the phone that you wanted to report child endangerment. Yes. My wife abandoned our 3-month-old daughter in a public trash bin yesterday afternoon. Mara looked up from her notepad. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Frank told the story again, providing every detail he could remember. Mara took notes and asked clarifying questions. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. Mr. Merrick, this is one of the most serious allegations I've heard in a long time. Do you have any evidence besides your own testimony? Frank pulled out his phone and played the recording from that morning. Mara listened intently, occasionally asking him to replay certain sections. She admits to planning it, Mara said when the recording ended. She chose the location deliberately because she knew you'd find a child there. Yes, and she shows no remorse. She's defending her actions. That's correct. Mara made more notes. Mr. Merrick, I have to ask this. Is there any possibility that your wife is suffering from postpartum depression or psychosis? Sometimes new mothers experience. She's trying to claim that now, but you heard the recording. This wasn't a moment of mental break. She planned it. She chose the location. She had a reason for doing it. What reason? To prove a point about how hard motherhood is for her. Mara set down her pen. Mr. Merrick, I'm going to open an investigation immediately. I'll need to interview both you and your wife, inspect your home, and evaluate your daughter's current safety. What does that mean for custody? That depends on what we find. If I determine that your daughter is in immediate danger, I can recommend emergency removal from the home. Will she be removed from both of us, or just from my wife? That would depend on the specific circumstances. Do you have family who could care for her temporarily if needed? My brother. But I want to be clear. I'm not a danger to my daughter. I'm the one who found her and got her medical attention. I understand. When can I schedule a home visit? As soon as possible. Mara flipped through her calendar. How about tomorrow morning? 10 o'clock. We'll be there. Mr. Merrick, one more thing. Don't discuss this investigation with your wife beforehand. I want her initial reactions to be unfiltered. Frank nodded. Understood. As he left the office, Frank felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. There was no going back now. He'd officially reported his wife to Child Protective Services for abandoning their baby. The legal machinery was starting to turn point 2 days later. Frank sat in a bland conference room at the courthouse with his attorney, David Walsh. Walsh was a family law specialist who'd handled dozens of custody cases. He'd listened to Frank's story and the recordings with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen the worst of human nature. The CPS report is damning, Walsh said, reviewing the paperwork. Ms. Jenks recommends immediate emergency custody arrangements. She found your wife's explanations inconsistent and concerning. What did Jean tell her? First, she denied it happened. Then she claimed you misunderstood what she meant on the recording. Then she suggested you might have staged the whole thing to frame her. Frank felt his jaw clench. She thinks I put my own daughter in a trash bin to frame her. Apparently. She also suggested you might be having an affair and want to get rid of her. That's insane. Yes, it is. Which is why Judge Morrison is likely to grant our emergency motion. The door opened and Jean entered with her attorney, Linda Foster. Jean wore a conservative dress and minimal makeup. She looked like a concerned mother fighting for her child, Frank watched his wife take her seat. 3 days ago, he would have said he knew her completely. Now he wondered if he'd ever known her at all. Judge Morrison entered and the hearing began. Walsh presented the evidence methodically. The hospital records showing Nevaeh's condition when found, the police report from the discovery scene, the recording of Jean's admission, and the CPS investigators' report that Jean's attorney tried to counter with claims of postpartum depression and Frank's controlling behavior. But the evidence was overwhelming. When Judge Morrison asked Jean directly about the incident, her answers were contradictory and defensive. Mrs. Merrick, the judge said, "Are you claiming that your husband fabricated evidence against you?" "I'm saying the situation has been misrepresented, Your Honor." "How so?" "My husband recorded our private conversation without my knowledge and took my words out of context." Judge Morrison looked at the transcript of the recording. "Mrs. Merrick, you stated that you deliberately chose the location because you knew your husband would find the child there. How is that taken out of context?" Jean's attorney whispered something to her. "Your Honor, my client was sleep-deprived and under extreme stress. Her statements don't reflect her true mental state at the time of the incident. So she's claiming her confession was false. She's claiming she wasn't thinking clearly when she made those statements." Judge Morrison looked unimpressed. "Ms. Foster, your client made these statements 2 days after the alleged incident, not in the immediate aftermath. She had time to think clearly." The hearing continued for another hour, but Frank could see the judge had already decided. When Judge Morrison announced his ruling, Frank felt a mix of relief and grim satisfaction. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm granting emergency temporary custody of the minor child to the father, Frank Merrick. The mother will be allowed supervised visitation only, pending a full custody evaluation." Jean's face went white. Her attorney immediately stood to object, but Judge Morrison had already moved on to scheduling the next hearing. Outside the courthouse, Walsh shook Frank's hand. "This is a good start, but it's just the beginning. She'll fight this with everything she has." "Let her fight," Frank said. "I have truth on my side." "Truth doesn't always win in family court, Frank. But in this case, I think it will." That evening, Frank called Jean's cousin June. He'd met her only a few times at family gatherings, but she'd always seemed like the most reasonable person in Jean's family. June worked at a small independent bookstore in downtown Boone. Frank found her there after closing time, counting the day's receipts. "Frank, what are you doing here? I need to talk to you about Jean." June's expression grew cautious. "What about her?" Frank told her about the incident, about the custody hearing, about everything that had happened. June listened without interruption, her face growing more troubled with each detail. "Oh God," June said when he finished. "I was afraid something like this would happen." "What do you mean?" June locked the front door and gestured for Frank to follow her to the back office. "Frank, there are things about Jean that her family doesn't talk about. Things we've all been pretending aren't real." "Like what?" "Like the fact that she's never shown normal emotional responses to anything. Like the way she treated her mother before she died." "What happened with her mother?" June sat down heavily in her desk chair. Jean cut her off completely over something trivial. Her mother asked Jean to call more often, and Jean decided that was manipulative and controlling. She wouldn't speak to her for the last 2 years of her life. Jean told me her mother was emotionally abusive. Her mother was lonely. She was a widow who wanted to hear from her daughter occasionally. Jean turned that into some kind of persecution complex. June opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook. Jean left this here about 6 months ago. She was ranting about pregnancy and motherhood, and she was writing in it obsessively. I found it after she left, and I kept it. Frank opened the notebook. The handwriting was Jean's, but the content was chilling. Page after page of rants about how pregnancy was biological imprisonment and how society tricks women into life sentences through motherhood. One entry stood out. "Everyone acts like having a baby is this beautiful thing, but it's really just another person demanding pieces of your soul until there's nothing left. I won't let that happen to me. I won't disappear just because I gave birth." "Jesus," Frank whispered. "There's more. Keep reading." Frank flipped through more pages. The entries became increasingly hostile toward the idea of motherhood, toward babies in general, toward the trap of family life. Why didn't you say something? June looked miserable. Say what? That my cousin writes weird things in a journal? That she seems cold sometimes? People would have thought I was jealous or stirring up family drama. This isn't just cold, June. This is someone who should never have had a child. I know that now. But 6 months ago, I thought maybe she was just scared. Lots of women have doubts about motherhood. Frank closed the notebook. Can I have this? I was hoping you'd ask. My lawyer said it could be important evidence. Your lawyer? I called him after you told me what happened. I want to know if I could be in legal trouble for not reporting my concerns earlier. And he said I couldn't have predicted this specific incident, but he thinks the journal entries could be relevant to a custody case. Frank studied June's face. Will you testify if I need you to? Yes. I should have spoken up before. Maybe if I had, this wouldn't have happened. June, this isn't your fault. You couldn't have known she'd actually abandoned the baby. But I knew she wasn't right. I knew she didn't have normal maternal feelings. Frank put the journal in his jacket pocket. What you're doing now matters more than what you didn't do before. June gave Frank another piece of information before he left the bookstore. Jean's ex-boyfriend Elliot Varn was still in town, working as a house sitter for wealthy families who traveled frequently. Frank found Elliot's contact information through a local property management company. When he called, Elliot was hesitant to meet. I don't really want to get involved in whatever's going on with Jean, Elliot said. She abandoned our 3-month-old daughter in a trash bin. I think you're already involved. A long pause. When do you want to meet? They arranged to meet at a coffee shop on King Street. Frank arrived first and waited in a corner booth. Elliot appeared 15 minutes later, looking around nervously before approaching. Elliot was thin and tired-looking, with prematurely gray hair and the careful movements of someone who'd been hurt and hadn't fully healed. He looked older than his 35 years. You said she abandoned your baby? Frank told the story again. With each retelling, it sounded more insane, more unthinkable. But Elliot didn't look shocked. He looked resigned. Yeah, Elliot said when Frank finished. That sounds like something she'd do. What do you mean? Elliot stirred his coffee absently. Jean doesn't see other people as real. They're just characters in her story. If a character becomes inconvenient to the plot, she writes them out. How did she write you out? Methodically. First, she convinced me that my art gallery was holding me back from my true potential. Then she isolated me from my friends and business partners. She made me financially dependent on her, then emotionally dependent. Then, when she'd taken everything I had to give, she just left. She left you, vanished. One day, she was planning our future together. The next day, she was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. She took some of my things and disappeared. Frank studied Elliot's face. When was this? About a year before she met you. Did you try to find her? Elliot laughed bitterly. For months. I thought something terrible had happened to her. I filed a missing person report. I hired a private investigator. The whole time, she was living 2 towns over, setting up her new life. How did you find out? She sent me a letter. Not an apology or an explanation. Just a letter telling me to stop looking for her because she was moving on to the next chapter. Frank felt a chill. She called it a chapter. That's how she thinks about life. It's all just chapters in the story of Jean. Other people are supporting characters who exist to serve her narrative. What happened to your gallery? I had to sell it. I couldn't afford to keep it running after she convinced me to liquidate my savings for our shared future. I lost everything. I'm sorry. Elliot shrugged. I'm better off without her. It took me 2 years of therapy to realize that. But it's true. She doesn't destroy people with fire, Frank. She does it by making them light to match themselves. Will you testify about this in court? You want me to testify against Jean? I want you to tell the truth about who she is. A judge needs to understand what kind of person would abandon an infant. Elliot was quiet for a long time. What would I have to say? Just what you told me. How she manipulated you, isolated you, then discarded you when you were no longer useful. And you think that will help keep your daughter safe? I think it will help a judge see the pattern. Jean didn't suddenly become dangerous when she gave birth. She's always been dangerous. The baby just gave her a new target. Elliot nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do it. But Frank, yeah, don't underestimate her. Jean is very good at making people believe whatever version of reality serves her purpose. She'll have a story that makes her the victim and you the villain. Let her try. Frank's confidence in his case was shaken 3 days later when he received a certified letter from Jean's attorney. She was filing a cross-petition for emergency custody, claiming that Frank was emotionally unstable and had a history of controlling and intimidating behavior. Frank read the documents with growing disbelief. According to Jean's petition, he was an obsessive micromanager who monitored her every movement. She claimed he'd isolated her from friends and family, controlled their finances, and showed concerning anger management issues. The petition painted a picture of Frank as a man who'd finally snapped under the pressure of new fatherhood and was now using false accusations to punish his wife for struggling with postpartum depression. Frank called his attorney immediately. "This is standard procedure," Walsh assured him. "When someone's backed into a corner, they attack. She's trying to flip the narrative and make herself the victim. But what if the judge believes her? Frank, we have evidence. We have recordings. We have witness testimony. She has accusations without proof. What about her claims that I'm controlling? Can she prove them? Does she have recordings of you threatening her? Documentation of financial abuse? Witnesses who've seen you intimidate her? No, because none of that happened. Then we'll be fine. But Frank, we need to be prepared for her to escalate this. She's going to get desperate, and desperate people do desperate things." That evening, Frank sat in his temporary apartment. He'd moved out of the house to avoid any accusations of intimidation and reviewed his case files. Everything he'd documented, every recording, every piece of evidence that proved Jean had abandoned their daughter and then lied about it. His phone rang. It was Ira. "Have you seen the news?" "What news?" "Turn on Channel 13. Frank found the remote and switched to the local news station. A reporter stood outside the courthouse, speaking to the camera. Local custody battle has taken an unusual turn as both parents accuse each other of child endangerment. Jean Merrick claims her estranged husband fabricated evidence against her in an attempt to gain sole custody of their infant daughter. Frank watched in amazement as Jean appeared on screen, tears streaming down her face as she spoke to another reporter. "I'm fighting for my daughter's safety," Jean said. "My husband has become increasingly controlling and paranoid since the baby was born. I'm afraid of what he might do if he gets sole custody." The report went on to describe the case as a he said, she said custody dispute where both parents were making serious allegations against each other. That Frank's phone rang again. This time it was Walsh. "Are you watching this?" "Yeah." "She's playing the victim card publicly. This is actually good for us." "How is this good?" "Because now she's on record making specific claims. We can disprove those claims with evidence. She's just given us more rope to hang her with." Frank watched Jean on TV, crying for the cameras, playing the role of the wronged mother fighting for her child. "David, what if people believe her?" "Frank, juries might believe a performance like that. But judges have seen it all before. Judge Morrison isn't going to be swayed by tears and accusations without evidence. So what do? We stick to our strategy. We present the facts methodically and let her dig her own grave with lies." Frank hung up and continued watching the news coverage. Jean was good at this, playing the victim, manipulating perception, making herself look sympathetic. But Frank had something she didn't: the truth. And the truth had a way of winning out, especially when it was backed up by evidence that he picked up his phone and started making notes for his testimony. If Jean wanted to turn this into a public spectacle, he'd give her one. But it wouldn't end the way she expected. 3 weeks later, Frank sat in the same courthouse conference room, but this time the atmosphere was different. His attorney had assembled a comprehensive case file that included the original evidence plus testimony from June, Elliot, and CPS investigator Mara Jenks. The judges reviewed all the preliminary materials, Walsh said, organizing his papers. Morrison doesn't like being manipulated, and Jean's media campaign backfired. 3 separate witnesses called the court to contradict her public statements. What kind of witnesses? Neighbors who saw her leaving the house with the baby on the day of the incident. A clerk at the gas station near the park who remembers her buying cigarettes around the time you found Nevaeh. And most importantly, a park maintenance worker who saw her at the trash bin area earlier that afternoon. Frank felt a surge of vindication. She was there earlier. According to the maintenance worker, she was standing near the bins around 2 o'clock, checking her phone repeatedly. He thought she was waiting for someone. She was timing it, making sure she knew when I'd be driving by. That's how we're going to present it. This wasn't a moment of postpartum crisis. This was calculated child endangerment. The door opened, and Jean entered with her attorney. She looked different, thinner, more desperate. The confident woman who'd faced the media cameras was gone, replaced by someone who knew her carefully constructed lies were falling apart. Judge Morrison entered and called the hearing to order. We're here for Mr. Merrick's petition for permanent sole custody of the minor child, Nevaeh Merrick, and Mrs. Merrick's cross-petition alleging parental unfitness. Walsh began with a methodical presentation of evidence. The original incident report, the hospital records, the recording of Jean's confession, the journal entries June had provided, and now the new witness testimony placing Jean at the scene earlier in the day. Your Honor, Walsh said, this evidence shows a pattern of calculated deception and child endangerment. Mrs. Merrick didn't have a momentary lapse in judgment. She planned this incident to manipulate her husband and justify her own inadequate parenting. Jean's attorney, Foster, tried to counter with a postpartum depression defense, but Judge Morrison interrupted. Ms. Foster, your client has given 3 different explanations for this incident. First, she denied it happened. Then she called it a test. Then she claimed it was a stress reaction. Now you're arguing it was postpartum depression. Which is it? Your Honor, my client was confused and traumatized. Was she confused when she spoke to the media? Because her statements to Channel 13 were quite clear and coherent. Foster had no answer for that. When Elliot took the stand, his testimony was devastating. He described Jean's pattern of manipulation, isolation, and abandonment in calm, factual terms. When Foster tried to discredit him as a bitter ex-boyfriend, Elliot's response was perfect. I'm not bitter, counselor. I'm grateful. Jean taught me to recognize manipulation when I see it. And I'm seeing it now. June's testimony was equally damaging. She presented Jean's journal entries as evidence of a deep-seated hostility toward motherhood and family life. When Foster argued that private journal entries shouldn't be admissible, Judge Morrison disagreed. These entries show the defendant's state of mind regarding motherhood and child-rearing. They're absolutely relevant to a custody determination. But the most powerful testimony came from Mara Jenks. The experienced CPS investigator described her interviews with Jean as concerning and inconsistent. In my 15 years doing this job, Jenks testified, I've seen parents make terrible mistakes under stress. I've seen postpartum depression, psychosis, and genuine mental health crises. This wasn't any of those things. Mrs. Merrick showed no remorse, no understanding of the danger she'd put her child in, and no capacity for self-reflection. In my professional opinion, she lacks the basic empathy required for safe parenting. When Jean finally took the stand in her own defense, she made things worse. Under cross-examination, she couldn't maintain her victim narrative. When Walsh pressed her about the timing of the incident, she became defensive and contradictory. Mrs. Merrick, you stated that you put your daughter in that location because you knew your husband would find her there, correct? I was under stress. I wasn't thinking clearly. But the maintenance worker saw you at that location 2 hours before your husband found the baby. Were you under stress for 2 hours? I don't remember being there earlier. So either the maintenance worker is lying or you're lying under oath. Which is it? Jean's attorney objected, but the damage was done. 2 days after the hearing, Frank received a call from the visitation supervisor. Jean had failed to show up for her scheduled time with Nevaeh. She called 15 minutes after the appointment time. The supervisor explained. She said she was running late and asked if she could take the baby for a walk around town instead of staying at the center. What did you tell her? I explained that supervised visitation means she has to stay at the center. She became agitated and hung up. Frank called Walsh immediately. Is this a violation of the court order? Technically, yes. But missing one appointment isn't grounds for revoking visitation entirely. That evening, Frank's phone rang. It was Ira. Frank, you need to get down here right now. Where are you? The gas station on 321, near the highway entrance. I've been following Jean like you asked, and she just tried to leave town with the baby. Frank's blood went cold. What do you mean she tried to leave town? She picked up Nevaeh from the visitation center. Somehow, I'm guessing she lied to the supervisor, and I followed her here. She's filling up her car and loading luggage into the trunk. I called the police, but you need to get here before she takes off. Frank was already grabbing his keys. Don't let her leave. I won't. Frank drove to the gas station with his heart pounding. He arrived just as police cars were pulling into the parking lot. Jean stood next to her car, holding Nevaeh, arguing with two officers. This is my daughter, Jean was saying. I have a right to take her wherever I want. Ma'am, we have a court order here that says you're only allowed supervised visitation. One of the officers replied. Frank approached the group. Jean saw him, and her expression hardened. Frank, tell them this is ridiculous. I'm her mother. Jean, you're in violation of a court order. I'm protecting my daughter from you. Officer Martinez looked at Frank. Mr. Merrick, can you verify that this child is your daughter and that there's a custody order in place? Frank showed him his copy of the court order and Nevaeh's birth certificate. My wife is only allowed supervised visitation. She's supposed to visit at the Family Services Center, not take the baby anywhere. Ma'am, Officer Martinez said to Jean, I need you to hand the child to Mr. Merrick and place your hands behind your back. This is insane. You're arresting me for trying to protect my own daughter. I'm arresting you for custodial interference and violation of a court order. Jean looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route. For a moment, Frank thought she might actually run. Then her shoulders sagged, and she handed Nevaeh to Frank. This isn't over, she said as the officers cuffed her. Frank held his daughter close, feeling her small heart beating against his chest. Yes, it is. Jean's arrest for custodial interference moved up the timeline for the final custody hearing. 1 week later, Frank sat in the courtroom knowing this would be the last time he'd have to face his wife in court. Jean looked haggard. The arrest had shaken her confidence, and her attempts to manipulate the situation had consistently backfired. Her attorney looked resigned to losing. Judge Morrison reviewed the case file before beginning. This court has reviewed all evidence and testimony regarding the custody of minor child Nevaeh Merrick. Before I render my decision, I want to hear final arguments from both parties. Foster stood first. Your Honor, my client is a victim of an orchestrated campaign by her estranged husband to deny her parental rights. Mrs. Merrick has struggled with the challenges of new motherhood, but she loves her daughter and deserves the chance to be part of her life. Ms. Foster, Judge Morrison interrupted, your client was arrested 3 days ago for attempting to flee the state with the child in violation of my court order. How does that demonstrate love for her daughter? My client was acting out of desperation, Your Honor. She felt she had no other way to protect her child for what she perceived as an abusive situation. Perceived? Ms. Foster, where is the evidence of abuse? Where are the witnesses, the documentation, the proof of any wrongdoing by Mr. Merrick? Foster had no answer. Walsh rose for his final argument. Your Honor, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. Mrs. Merrick deliberately endangered her infant daughter's life, lied about it repeatedly, showed no remorse for her actions, and then violated this court's orders when those lies were exposed. She has demonstrated a complete lack of fitness for parenting. Judge Morrison nodded. Mr. Walsh, what is your client seeking? Full permanent custody of the minor child, termination of Mrs. Merrick's parental rights, and protection from any future contact with the child. That's a serious request. This is a serious case, Your Honor. A 3-month-old infant was left in a trash bin by her own mother. If that doesn't warrant termination of parental rights, I don't know what does. Judge Morrison turned to Jean. Mrs. Merrick, before I render my decision, do you have anything you'd like to say? Jean stood slowly. For a moment, Frank thought she might finally show some genuine remorse, some recognition of what she'd done. Instead, she said, Your Honor, I'm fighting for my daughter because I love her. Everything I've done has been to protect her from a father who doesn't understand the challenges of motherhood. Judge Morrison stared at her. Mrs. Merrick, you put your infant daughter in a trash bin. How was that protecting her? I was trying to show my husband how overwhelmed I was. I needed help, and no one was listening. So you endangered your child to make a point. I knew Frank would find her. I knew she'd be safe. Frank watched the judge's expression grow colder with each word Jean spoke. She was digging her own grave, and she didn't even realize it. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Merrick, let me make sure I understand your testimony. You deliberately placed your 3-month-old daughter in a public trash bin, not because of mental illness or a moment of poor judgment, but as a calculated action to prove a point to your husband. Ah, yes, but I knew she'd be safe. How could you possibly know that? Because Frank is predictable. I knew he'd find her. And if he'd been wrong? If he'd taken a different route home? If he'd had his radio turned up? If he'd stopped somewhere else first? Jean had no answer. Judge Morrison sat back. I've heard enough. Mrs. Merrick, your testimony today has convinced me that the original incident was not the result of postpartum depression, sleep deprivation, or any other mitigating factor. You have admitted under oath that you deliberately endangered your infant daughter as part of a calculated plan to manipulate your husband. The judge paused, letting his words sink in. Furthermore, your recent violation of this court's visitation order demonstrates a continued disregard for your daughter's best interests and the rule of law. In my 23 years on the bench, I have never seen a more clear-cut case of parental unfitness. Frank felt his heart racing as the judge continued. Therefore, this court grants permanent sole custody of the minor child Nevaeh Merrick to her father, Frank Merrick. Mrs. Merrick's parental rights are hereby terminated. She is prohibited from any contact with the child and from coming within 500 feet of Mr. Merrick or his residence. Jean stood up, her face white. You can't do this. She's my daughter. Mrs. Merrick, you forfeited your right to call her your daughter when you put her in a trash bin. This case is closed. 2 weeks after the custody hearing, Frank met with his attorney to discuss the civil aspects of his case. With custody resolved, they could now focus on the financial consequences of Jean's actions. The court's custody ruling gives us significant leverage, Walsh explained. Judge Morrison's finding that Jean deliberately endangered the child creates grounds for claiming she breached her marital duties. What does that mean practically? It means we can argue that she's not entitled to an equal division of marital assets. Her actions caused reputational damage, legal expenses, and emotional trauma. We can seek to recover those costs from her share of the marital estate. What kind of assets are we talking about? Walsh pulled out a financial summary. Your house is worth about $180,000. You have $45,000 in joint savings accounts, $60,000 in retirement accounts, and about $25,000 in other assets. Normally, she'd be entitled to half of everything. And now we argue that her criminal behavior and child endangerment voided her claim to marital assets. We're asking the court to award you the house, the savings, and your retirement accounts in full. Can you do that? North Carolina allows judges to consider misconduct when dividing marital property. Child abandonment definitely qualifies as misconduct. The financial hearing took place 2 months later. Jean, now representing herself after firing her attorney, looked defeated before it even began. Judge Thompson, who handled the civil division, reviewed the custody court's findings and the evidence of Jean's actions. Mrs. Merrick, Judge Thompson said, the custody court found that you deliberately endangered your infant daughter. You were arrested for violating court orders. You showed no remorse for actions that could have resulted in your child's death. These are not the actions of someone who deserves an equal share of marital assets. Jean tried to argue that the financial matters should be separate from the custody issues, but Judge Thompson disagreed. Your actions caused significant legal expenses, emotional trauma, and reputational damage to your husband. You breached fundamental marital duties through your criminal behavior. This court awards the marital residence, all savings accounts, and all retirement accounts to Mr. Merrick. Frank walked out of the courthouse owning everything he and Jean had built together. She left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a criminal record point. 6 months later, Frank sat on the porch of a small rental house outside Boone, watching Nevaeh play in a portable crib he'd set up in the shade. She was 9 months old now, healthy and happy, with no memory of the day her mother had tried to throw her away. The house was simple but comfortable, surrounded by trees and far enough from town to provide real privacy. Frank had sold the marital home and used the proceeds to pay off all debts and establish a college fund for Nevaeh. The rest went toward buying this property, which he planned to purchase once the rental agreement expired. Ira's truck pulled into the driveway. Frank's brother had become a regular visitor, often bringing groceries or just checking in. The near loss of his niece had shaken Ira almost as much as it had Frank. "How's the little princess today?" Ira asked, walking over to tickle Nevaeh's feet. "She's good. Took her first real steps yesterday." "No kidding? And I missed it." "Don't worry, she'll do it again. She's been practicing all morning." Ira sat down in the other porch chair. "Any word from Jean's lawyer about the appeal?" "Walsh says she's running out of options. Her criminal conviction for custodial interference makes it almost impossible to overturn the custody ruling." "Good. That woman shouldn't be allowed within 100 miles of any child." Frank nodded, watching Nevaeh try to pull herself up using the crib rails. "Sometimes I still can't believe it happened. That someone could do that to their own child. Believe it. Some people just aren't wired right, Frank. Jean's one of them." A car pulled up behind Ira's truck. Frank recognized June's small sedan. She'd become an important part of their lives, one of the few people Frank trusted to babysit when he had to work late. "Uncle Ira," June called out, using the joke title they'd given her. "How's my favorite niece?" "She walked yesterday," Ira announced proudly. "Really?" "Nevaeh, show Aunt June how you walk." Frank watched the easy interaction between his daughter and the people who'd chosen to be part of her life. This was what family was supposed to look like: people who protected each other, who showed up when needed, who put the child's welfare first. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mara Jenks, the CPS investigator who'd handled their case. "Saw the news about Jean's failed appeal. Hope you and Nevaeh are doing well. You made the right choice fighting for her." Frank typed back, "Thanks. We're doing great." And they were. For the first time in months, Frank felt truly at peace. Jean was out of their lives permanently, unable to hurt Nevaeh or manipulate their family anymore. The legal battles were over. The financial settlements were complete. Later that evening, after June and Ira had left, Frank put Nevaeh to bed and went to his workshop in the garage. He'd been working on a special project, building a new crib from scratch. Using the maple boards he'd bought the day he found her in that trash bin. The wood was beautiful, smooth, and strong. Frank shaped each piece carefully, joining them with precision and care. This crib would be perfect, built to last for generations. Someday, maybe Nevaeh would use it for her own children. As he worked, Frank thought about the future. Nevaeh would grow up knowing she was wanted, protected, and loved. She'd never have to wonder if her parents saw her as a burden or an inconvenience. She'd never have to fear being abandoned or thrown away. Frank finished sanding the final rail and stepped back to admire his work. The crib was sturdy and beautiful, built with the same methodical care he'd used to destroy Jean's lies and protect his daughter. He thought about calling it justice, but that wasn't quite right. Justice was what had happened in court. This was something different. This was love made manifest in wood and dedication. Frank ran his hand along the smooth surface of the crib rail. "Revenge isn't fire," he said quietly to himself, remembering something his father had once told him. "It's stone. You lay it piece by piece until it's too heavy for them to lift again." Jean had tried to destroy their family with lies and manipulation. Frank had responded with truth and patience, building a case so solid that no amount of deception could overcome it. Now she was gone, and they were free. Frank turned off the workshop lights and went back into the house. Nevaeh slept peacefully in her temporary crib, one small fist curled next to her cheek. Tomorrow he would start setting up the new crib, the one that would keep her safe for years to come. Outside, the North Carolina mountains stood silent under a canopy of stars. Inside, a father and daughter slept secure in the knowledge that some things, love, protection, family, were stronger than the people who tried to destroy them. Frank had won more than a custody battle. He'd won the right to raise his daughter in safety, away from someone who saw children as inconveniences rather than gifts. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered.